I think of all of the emotions, shame is the most difficult to work through. I know this is particularly the case in my own personal journey, and I find it's applicable to so much of the work I do with clients as well. Now, it's worth noting, first of all, that shame is a normal human emotion. I mean, it keeps us humble, it keeps us modest, it provides us with limitations, and it allows us to live with integrity. However, there is a level of shame that's referred to as toxic shame. And when this occurs, if you're brought up in that sort of environment, it has detrimental effects on your ability to show up as your true self in your life, in your relationships, because you were never given that sense of worth. You were never allowed to be your authentic self. And as I said, this can wreak havoc on so many aspects of your life without you even recognizing it. So, what does a toxic shame environment look like? Well, it can look like multiple things. It can be very controlled or very chaotic. It can be driven by perfectionist standards. It can be very non structured. There tends to be a lot of blame. There tends to be a sense of not being heard, that you're always in the wrong, that you're not allowed to be vulnerable, that you can't trust, that you can't make mistakes, and you certainly cannot show your emotions. And consequently, you develop low tolerance for your emotions, low tolerance for other people, very perfectionist standards, and this concept of I am flawed, I am inadequate, I am not good enough. And generally, the way we cope with this is by creating defense mechanisms or coping mechanisms. Some of them may come across as normal, like perfectionist standards, which is often seen as this amazing attribute to have, but which is so unhealthy. But then you have the more dysfunctional ones, like addiction, like denial, like projection, like numbing out with alcohol or drugs or food or sex or whatever it is that's available to you. Whatever it is that keeps you from living a conscious, aware life, because tolerating shame, living in a state of shame, is horrific. It's a horrible, horrible emotion if it's allowed to fester, as opposed to dealing with it and moving through it, processing it. So, how do you go about getting beyond this? Well, first of all, you need to create an awareness of the fact that you are living in that state, that that's how you were brought up. And oftentimes we think that it was just a case of tough love or something like that. But if you were made feel like you were inadequate, like you weren't worth loving, that everything that you did was wrong, that you were always to blame, I mean, that is emotional neglect and emotional abuse, and it has to be dealt with at some stage. And I mean, there's a real grieving process with this, because when you start to recognize the way in which, through no fault of their own possibly, I mean, parents do the best that they can, but sometimes they just fail to show up in the way that a child requires them to be there. But if you were brought up like that, it's like as if you nearly have to grieve the childhood that you never had. And then you have to go about healing your inner child in order to allow that inner child to start to shine, to be able to start showing up as your authentic self. So there's a lot of healing to be done, a lot of validation to be done, but there's also recognizing the way in which this impacts on your behavior, because oftentimes when we were raised in shame, we can tend to have some very I suppose unattractive aspects to our personality. As I said, we can hold other people to very high standards. We can be very critical. We can be very judgmental. And like, I'm holding my own hand up here, all of these things that can be really, really unfair for other people in your life. So you have to be accountable in this. You can't just be like, oh, I had this fucking terrible childhood, so that means I'm justified to lash out at everybody that comes, within a 5 mile radius of me. No, that's not the case. You have to be accountable. You have to recognize the way in which your triggers and your moods and your reactions are impacting both on yourself and on other people. Now, another, I suppose, thing I notice in people who grew up in a very shameful, toxic environment is they have great difficulty in getting their needs met because they just don't feel like they deserve being met, and yet they have this internal frustration because they know what it is that they need, or sometimes they don't even know what they need, but it's just that they constantly feel like as if something is missing, like there's this massive void, like as if the relationships in their life are letting them down. And it's because they have never felt safe to be able to express their needs. Likewise, they have never felt it was safe to be able to express strong emotions. So everything is repressed: your needs, your emotions, your values, your authentic self, and you're just going round the place like a ghost of the person that you should be, and you never feel like you're living the life that you ought to. You feel angry, you feel resentful, you feel sad, you feel all of these emotions that are so far away from feeling joyful and feeling safe and feeling content and, you know, just feeling happy. And it's such a sad way to spend your life, but it is not a life sentence. I mean, there's a lot of work that can be done, and I suppose first of all, as I said, the awareness side of things, but then you can introduce things like cognitive behavioral therapy, developing emotional regulation, developing a meditative practice can be extremely beneficial. Developing a spiritual belief. Now, that's not necessarily a religious belief, but just a belief in a higher power, you know, handing over the fact that you are fallible, that you have all of these flaws, that you do feel guilty, and not feeling that you have to carry it all of the time. Likewise, what can be extremely beneficial is a corrective experience. Now, this can sometimes take place in the context of a relationship. However, oftentimes it takes place in the context of a therapeutic relationship where you engage with your therapist and your therapist gives you the validation, the structure that you needed, the reassurance and the healing capacity, because you have the capacity to heal inside of you. So a lot of the work that needs to be done is relational. You have to do work on your authentic self, on your inner child, and there is quite a bit of work to be done on forgiveness. And that's just not forgiveness of your family of origin. It's also forgiveness of yourself, because again, when you have been led to believe that you can never make mistakes, that you can never fuck up, I mean, you become your own worst critic. You internalize all of that guilt, you internalize all of that criticism, and you go round the place constantly feeling guilty, constantly feeling ashamed. And there's only so much of that the body can take, you know, before it lashes out at somebody else or tries to project onto other people. And this is why so many people who experience shame dissociate or numb out or find a way of coping that just means they don't have to sit with the horrible sensations. Likewise, they revert to, I suppose, coping mechanisms of the mind, such as overgeneralization, all or nothing thinking, everything being should, either or, overgeneralization, personalization, all of these distortions, for want of a better word, that impact on your ability to interpret the world the way the world actually is. A lot of work involved, but it is something that is very possible to come through and to come out the other side and to find yourself living a life that reflects what it is that you were always meant to be, you know, to find your true voice, to find your authentic self. If this is something that you would be interested in working with me on, get in touch with me on the website. It's fundamentals.ie.